I get questions reasonably often about faith. And I've struggled to understand faith myself, exactly what it is. We have this great section from Hebrews. I thought it worthwhile going through it a little more slowly, perhaps, because there are some interesting things here that might help us understand better what faith is. First of all, I do hear people talk about faith and read things about faith that seem like are not fully faith. Sometimes faith is confused with trust, even obedience or confidence. I have faith in you. It's kind of a statement of confidence in the person. I think faith has these things as maybe part of its makeup. These are elements, maybe, of faith. But I don't think they get to the heart of faith. And I like this first sentence, really. Faith, and even the first half of the sentence is good to start with. Faith is the realization of what is hoped for. So actually, we don't begin with faith. We begin with hope. And again, actually, we don't really even begin with hope. Hope comes after something else. And so with Abraham, for instance, first comes the call of God and the promise. God calls Abraham to go out to a land that he's going to give him, and he promises him that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky or the sands on the shore of the sea. And so first comes the promise of God, and Abraham hopes in that promise. But then Abraham goes even further. So faith is the realization of what is hoped for. Now, not to be too technical here, I'm already a little technical, but faith, the realization, in other words, Abraham can't make the promise come true, right? That's God's part to do. So what does it mean that faith is the realization of what is hoped for? Well, it can't be the full realization of it, because Abraham's faith, right? Abraham never saw, at least as he was alive as a human person walking on the earth, all these descendants. When we're promised eternal life, right? Faith is the realization of what we hope for. We hope for eternal life, but when we actually get there, we won't need faith anymore, right? I'm pretty sure what this really has to mean is that it's the realization here on earth, right? It's of what we hope for. We live as if what we hope for is realized. In other words, so Abraham gets this call, and he goes out. First of all, the letter to the Hebrews says, he went out not knowing where he was to go. And that's always an element of faith, is an element of unknowing. That's why we call it a leap of faith. Faith is stepping out even when what we hope for isn't there yet. It isn't seen. But we still step out as if there was something to walk on. So if you're waiting, notice Abraham didn't say, tell you what, God, you get all that set up and built, and then call me back and I'll go there. No, God just promises it, and so Abraham sets out. That's a very important element of faith. If you're waiting for complete certainty before you answer whatever God is calling you to. That's not faith. And as far as I can tell anyway, God doesn't give certainty very often. And what does he do? The writer here says that Abraham sojourned. That word is, sojourners are people that dwell temporarily. They're moving on somewhere, And so he sojourned in the promised land in tents. Again, tents are a temporary dwelling. So he lives there in tents. He was looking forward to the city that God would build with foundations, stone walls, etc. He's looking forward to it, but he was living there as if God had done it already. And I think that's really the core of faith. Living as if what is promised has happened already. And I invite you to think about that a little bit now and later. Living as if what has been promised is here already. That, I think, is really at the core of faith. That we live our lives as if what God had promised has already been given us. It's already there. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So, the martyrs, for instance. It's why martyrs can be martyrs. The letter here, he mentions that Abraham's descendants were not looking backwards. Abraham was not hanging on to what he had. Abraham was reaching out for what was promised him. And so, just as Abraham was already living the life in the promised land as if it was given to him already, so the martyrs were already living their eternal life. They already had one hand on it, so to speak, or one foot in eternal. They weren't going to turn back. They weren't looking back at their material lives, their earthly lives. They weren't willing to let go of eternal life just to save this material life. And so they let their material lives go because they were reaching forward and living their eternal life with God as if it was already there. And you see what happens then. We can look on martyrdom as sacrifice and tragedy, and it's sad, it's a terrible thing, it's a loss, all that. But that's not the way the martyrs, apparently, the ones who talk about it, or the ones who it's certainly not the way the church talks about martyrdom. Martyrdom is a reaching forward for something even better that God has promised us. Priests and religious, for instance. Again, we think about celibacy sometimes as a sacrifice, as suffering, as whatever, missing something, a loss. And it is all those things to some degree. But a person who's living celibacy the way it's intended to be living is living with one foot, so to speak, in eternal life. In eternal life, our communion with God and with each other is going to be so profound that we don't need marriage. And so the true celibate, not just the bachelor or the whatever the true celibate is engaged in that life already, is living a life of communion with God and with others in some way, that he or she doesn't need to be married, or is reaching forward, And it's meant to be a sign, a symbol, a reminder to those of you who are living married lives. Not that your married life is less or something, or not as good, but it's a reminder to you that married life, as beautiful as it is an earthly and temporary state. that it's to kind of encourage you to also keep looking forward when the time in your life, in eternal life, when your communion with God will be perfect, when your communion with your spouse will be deeper even than marriage. And so the idea of faith is that we're living a life that's promised to us even now before it's given to us, so to speak. I wrote these. Where did they go? I think I'll remember them. I left them on my desk. But I wrote this down, see if this will help. Fear is living in a way not believing that the promise will be fulfilled. And so, since you're not trusting that the promise will be fulfilled, you have to do and keep something on your own. Hope is living confident that the promise will be fulfilled. Faith is living as if the promise had already been fulfilled, and you're living that promise now. The idea of faith is it's a deep thing, deeper than I think we give it credit all the time. So I invite you to consider this idea about faith and to see where you're living in your life, according to the call that you feel is coming from God. Are you living in fear, hesitating to give yourself to what God is calling you to? Are you hoping but not yet living it? Or are you giving yourself, you stepping out, not knowing where exactly you're going, but heading toward what God has promised you and living that even now, even before God has actually given it to you?